The Krell Empire had conquered 600 worlds, and nobody had ever stopped them before because they were too strong, and too many, and too certain of their power over everyone else in the universe. And when their scouts found Earth spinning quietly around its small yellow sun, they expected the same easy victory they had enjoyed for thousands of years. Without question or doubt, or any reason to think this time would be different from all the other times when species had looked at their massive fleets and chosen to surrender rather than die fighting a battle they could never win against such overwhelming force and superior technology. Commander Zethrak stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the data scroll across the screen showing him everything about this new planet called Earth. And what he saw made him confident that this would be another simple conquest to add to his long list of victories, because the humans had only basic nuclear weapons and no unified government, and they fought among themselves constantly, which meant they would fall apart quickly when faced with real external pressure from an organized military force like the Krell Armada. And he turned to his crew and ordered them to prepare 1,000 ships for the subjugation mission, which was standard protocol for a primitive world that posed no real threat to the Empire's interests or security. The 1,000 warships entered Earth's solar system on a Tuesday morning, moving in perfect formation, like a dark cloud blotting out the stars, and within hours, every military radar on Earth had detected them. And within a day, every government knew that something impossible was happening, and within 2 days panic had spread across the entire planet as people realized that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that their new neighbors had not come in peace or friendship, but in conquest and domination. And the news channels showed the same images over and over of the massive alien fleet approaching Earth with clear hostile intent, while politicians argued about what to do and military forces mobilized, even though everyone knew deep down that 200 primitive spacecraft could never defeat 1,000 advanced warships in any kind of fair fight. Jake Morrison sat in his monitoring station outside Denver, watching the data streams with growing understanding of what the alien formation meant. And he was not military or government or anyone particularly important in the grand scheme of things, because he just worked as a civilian contractor watching deep space telemetry for unusual patterns and anomalies. And what he saw in the approaching fleet's behavior made him realize something that others had missed in their panic and fear, which was that these aliens were not scouting or being careful or treating humanity as a potential threat, but instead were simply driving straight toward Earth like herders approaching cattle that needed to be rounded up and controlled. And that arrogance told Jake everything he needed to know about how the Krell thought and what they expected from this encounter. Helen Price leaned over his shoulder and asked him what he was thinking, and Jake told her that the aliens had done this many times before, and it had always worked exactly as they planned it, and that Earth's military forces were preparing for the wrong kind of response, because fighting would just give the Krell what they expected, which was brief resistance followed by inevitable surrender. And Helen asked him what humanity should do instead, if fighting was pointless. And Jake stood up, grabbing his jacket, and said that maybe the answer was not to fight, but to make the aliens understand something they had apparently never learned before, which was that some species refuse to accept conquest, no matter what the odds or consequences might be. Jake drove through the night making phone calls and sending messages, trying to reach someone in authority who would listen to his theory about alien psychology and how to respond to this threat in a way that might actually work instead of just delaying the inevitable. And he finally found General Linda Hayes at NORAD, who had spent 30 years preparing for threats that might never come, and she listened to his ideas with growing interest, even though he was just a civilian with no military training or strategic experience. And when he finished explaining his plan, she asked him the obvious question, which was whether he was really volunteering to fly up there alone and talk to an empire that had conquered 600 worlds. And Jake said yes, because someone had to try something different, and she studied him for a long moment before nodding and making the arrangements. 3 hours later, Jake sat alone in the pilot seat of a small diplomatic shuttle called the Aurora, that had been hastily equipped with the best communication equipment Earth could provide. And as he launched from Cape Canaveral, his last words to ground control were simple and direct, which was that if his plan did not work, at least humanity would know they had tried something other than just fighting or surrendering. And the Aurora rose through Earth's atmosphere, climbing toward the massive armada that waited above like a mountain of metal and weapons and centuries of unquestioned victory. Commander Zethrak watched the single small ship approaching his fleet, and felt amused rather than threatened. Because what kind of species sends one vessel as a response to 1,000 warships? And his communications officer reported that the shuttle was broadcasting a request for diplomatic contact on all frequencies, and Zethrak laughed at the absurdity of it, but decided to allow the human to speak, because letting Earth hear one of their own beg for mercy would make the subjugation easier and more complete. And he opened a channel and introduced himself as Commander Zethrak of the Krell Empire, and informed the human that Earth was now property of the Empire, and that surrender was the only option available, and resistance would result in complete eradication. Jake Morrison sat quietly for a moment studying the alien commander's face on his screen, and then he smiled and said his name was Jake Morrison, and that he was nobody important, just a guy who watched numbers on screens. But he had a question for the commander, which was this, and he leaned forward and asked whether in all those 600 conquests over thousands of years, anyone had ever just said no and refused to surrender, not because they thought they could win, but simply because they would not accept being conquered. And Zethrak's expression changed slightly as he considered the question, and Jake pressed on saying that he thought the Krell had never met anyone who chose dignity over survival, and that they were about to learn something new about what happens when an empire meets a species that would rather burn than kneel. The silence stretched across the void between them, heavy with implications and possibilities, and Commander Zethrak finally responded, asking whether Jake really thought words would stop what was already inevitable, and Jake replied that he thought the Krell had never met humanity before, and were about to discover that some species choose to stand even when standing is impossible, and Zethrak ordered his weapons officer to destroy the shuttle, but before the order could be executed, Jake pressed a button and broadcast his message across every frequency to every ship in the Krell fleet and every receiver on Earth, and his words rang out clear and strong, saying that Earth had one answer to the Empire's demands, which was no, and that humanity would not surrender or comply or bow, and that the Krell could break cities but not human will, and could shatter ships but not human spirit, and that Earth does not surrender, not today, not ever, not to anyone. The transmission ended, and the Aurora hung in space, tiny and fragile before the massive fleet. And on Earth 8 billion humans heard those words, and something ancient stirred in their hearts, which was the thing that had always made humanity dangerous, which was hope mixed with defiance and backed by the certainty that some things are worth dying for. And Jake Morrison waited for the Krell response, knowing he was just one man who refused to kneel, but somehow sensing that sometimes that is all it takes to change everything. Commander Zethrak stared at the small shuttle floating before his flagship, and for the first time in 3 centuries of conquest, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his mind, which was uncertainty about what to do next, because this human had just done something that no conquered species had ever done before, which was to openly declare war on the entire Krell Empire, while knowing full well that such a declaration would lead to certain death and complete destruction. And yet the human had made that choice anyway, with full awareness of the consequences, and that simple act of defiance was more disturbing than any weapon or military force could have been. His communications officer reported nervously that the human's broadcast had gone across all channels, and every ship in the fleet had received it, and every listening post across the sector had heard it, and based on the signal strength, every device on the planet Earth had picked it up as well, which meant that Jake Morrison had just made his defiant declaration in front of his entire species, and the entire Krell Armada and Zethrak understood that this was not just one man speaking, but one man giving voice to what 8 billion humans were thinking and feeling and choosing in that moment. And the weight of that unified defiance was something new in his long experience of conquest and subjugation. The tactical officer spoke carefully, saying that regulations stated that open defiance from a primitive species required immediate demonstration of force, and that they should destroy Earth's orbital installations and major population centers, to show the humans that resistance was futile and that compliance was the only path to survival. But Zethrak raised his hand for silence, because he was thinking about something that had never occurred to him before in 300 years of service, which was whether crushing everything in his path was actually the mark of strength, or simply the easiest option when facing species that valued survival over dignity and honor. On Earth, the reaction to Jake Morrison's broadcast was immediate and profound, because the message had done something that decades of United Nations meetings and diplomatic efforts had never accomplished. which was to unify the entire planet under one common cause and one shared identity. And within an hour of the transmission, every government had put aside territorial disputes and political differences and ideological conflicts, because when faced with extinction from an external threat, humanity remembered that it was one species with one home and one chance to choose what it would be in its final moments, and that choice was becoming clear across every continent and every culture and every human heart. General Linda Hayes stood in the command center at NORAD watching the tactical display with grim determination, and knowing that the numbers were impossible because Earth had maybe 200 combat-capable spacecraft against 1,000 Krell warships, and each alien vessel was the size of an aircraft carrier and carried weapons that could reduce cities to ash in seconds. And her aide asked quietly whether they should evacuate major population centers, and Hayes replied, asking where people would evacuate to if the aliens decided to attack, because there was nowhere on Earth that would be safe from orbital bombardment. And she said that if the Krell were going to hit them, then people needed to be at their posts, either fighting or helping or just standing witness to what humanity chose in its darkest hour. Hayes picked up her phone and ordered every pilot they had to prepare for launch, and when her aide protested, saying that even with every ship Earth had, the math was still impossible, Hayes cut him off and said that Morrison had gone up there alone and told an empire to go to hell, and that the least humanity could do was stand with him and show the Krell that humans do not abandon their own, even in the face of certain death. And within minutes the order went out across the planet to every military base and every space facility and every pilot who had ever dreamed of flying among the stars. In cities across Earth, people poured into the streets, not fleeing or rioting, but gathering together in public squares and parks and open spaces where they could see the sky and be together with other humans in what might be the last hours of human civilization. And in New York and Mumbai and Lagos and Seoul and Sao Paulo and Melbourne, humans stood shoulder to shoulder watching the sky and holding each other and singing songs and telling stories and doing what humanity had always done. When faced with impossible odds, which was to find meaning in the moment and connection with each other, and refusal to go quietly into the darkness, a grandmother in Beijing held her grandson's hand and whispered that he should remember this moment, and remember that humanity did not hide or beg or surrender, but stood up and said no to tyranny and oppression. And a father in Cairo lifted his daughter to his shoulder so she could see the stars, even though fear twisted in his stomach, and he told her that they were still here, and still standing, and still human, no matter what happened next. And those small moments of courage and love, multiplied across billions of people, created something that the Krell Empire had never encountered before, which was a species unified not by government or military command, but by shared choice and common humanity. Jake Morrison ran through his options in the Aurora and realized he had communication equipment and basic thrusters and about 6 hours of life support remaining, and he did not have weapons or shields or anything except the choice he had already made, and his console chimed with an incoming message from the Krell flagship, and he accepted it and saw that Commander Zethrak's expression had changed somehow, and the amusement was gone, replaced by something harder to identify on an alien face. Zethrak said that he had consulted with Imperial Command and that Jake's defiance had been noted and found interesting, and that the Empire was giving Earth one final chance to avoid destruction, and Jake should return to his planet and convince the human leaders to surrender, and if he did this, then the Krell would spare the major population centers and continue this foolishness, and the Empire would demonstrate why resistance was futile. And Jake shook his head slowly and said that Zethrak still did not understand what was happening here, because this was not about tactics or strategy or counting ships and calculating odds, but about something more fundamental to what made life worth living in the first place. Jake leaned forward and explained that the Krell were asking humanity to trade dignity for survival and freedom for safety, but that without dignity and freedom, survival was just existence, and existence alone was not worth the price of surrendering everything that made humans actually human. And Zethrak was silent for a long moment before saying that Jake was one being in one small ship, and behind him were 1,000 vessels crewed by millions, and that words changed nothing about the reality of power and force. And Jake replied that his words were all he had, so he would use them, and that if the Krell wanted Earth, they would have to go through him first. The communication cut off, and on the Krell flagship, Zethrak turned to his bridge crew and ordered them to arm all forward weapons and target the human shuttle, and prepare to fire on his mark. But before he could give the final order, his sensor operator called out that there were multiple launches from the planet's surface and dozens of craft were entering orbital space. And on the tactical display, the signatures appeared one by one, and then in groups as Earth's entire space force, such as it was rose to meet the Krell fleet. And it was still only 200 ships against 1,000, but every single human craft positioned itself in a defensive formation around the Aurora, and around Jake Morrison, and around that one man who had stood alone but was alone no longer. General Hayes transmitted on an open channel identifying herself as General Linda Hayes of Earth Defense Command, and saying that Commander Zethrak had wanted to see humanity, and here they were, and every ship represented someone who chose to stand, and they were mothers and fathers and sons and daughters and soldiers and civilians, and they were not a warrior race or a mighty empire, but just people who refused to let one of their own face the darkness alone, and one by one, other voices joined. The transmission saying they were standing with Morrison and standing with Earth and standing for humanity. The channels filled with declarations from hundreds of voices and hundreds of humans all making the same choice. And in the Aurora, Jake Morrison felt tears on his face because he had gone up alone and prepared to die alone, hoping only to inspire some resistance, but instead humanity had risen as one. And his console lit up with private messages from Helen Price saying he was an idiot, but she was proud, and from his sister in Portland saying that whatever happened next, he had reminded everyone why they were human, and from a stranger in Tokyo saying that her daughter had asked what courage looked like and she had shown her Jake. On Earth, the unity continued spreading as engineers who had been enemies worked together to retrofit more ships, and scientists shared data across borders without hesitation, and children drew pictures of the Aurora standing against the Krell fleet, and held them up to the sky. And in the Krell flagship, Zethrak studied the defensive formation, and saw that the human ships were pathetic by Imperial standards, but there was something in how they positioned themselves, and how they had all risen together that made him pause and remember that in 600 conquests no species had ever done this and no conquered world had. The pause that followed lasted 17 minutes, which in cosmic terms was nothing more than a blink. But for Jake Morrison, drifting between the Krell Armada and Earth, those 17 minutes stretched into something that felt like eternity as his life support systems hummed quietly, and behind him 200 human vessels held their positions with their crews waiting for the order that would tell them whether they would fight or die, or somehow miraculously survive. And on Earth, 8 billion people watched their screens and their skies with their futures hanging in a balance that could tip either way with a single word or command. Commander Zethrak faced the holographic image of Supreme Admiral Corthral, who was the direct representative of the Eternal Emperor himself, and whose scales were deep crimson, marked with silver glyphs that represented 1,000 successful campaigns across the known galaxies, and the Admiral's expression showed barely controlled rage, as he demanded that Zethrak explain why his fleet remained stationary, and why this primitive world still existed, and why he had not already completed what should have been a routine subjugation of a species that could not possibly stand against the might of the Krell Empire. Zethrak chose his words carefully as he explained that the humans had displayed unprecedented unity and defiance, and that their response was anomalous compared to every other species the Empire had encountered, and Supreme Admiral Corthral laughed harshly and said that the humans were primitives with barely 200 ships against 1,000 of the Empire's finest vessels, and there was nothing anomalous about those numbers at all, and Zethrak should simply give the order and complete the mission as protocol demanded and regulations required. But Zethrak did not move toward giving that order, and instead said with respect that the numbers did not tell the full story, because these humans had known they could not win, and had known that resistance was futile, but one of them had come out, alone anyway, just to tell the Krell no, and then others had followed. Not because they thought they could win, but because they refused to let him stand alone. And they were not fighting to win, but fighting, because surrender was unacceptable to them, at a fundamental level that went beyond logic or survival instinct, and Supreme Admiral Corthral demanded to know what difference that made to the outcome. Zethrak paused and then said something that could end his career or his life, which was that in 300 years of service, he had conquered 600 worlds and broken species that fought with valor and destroyed civilizations that begged for mercy. But he had never seen a species choose extinction over submission when submission was clearly the logical choice, and these humans were different in a way that mattered. And if the Empire destroyed them, they would not be conquering a world, but committing genocide against a species that could have had value, and he asked what the point was of destroying them. Simply because they said no. The hologram flickered with the Admiral's rage, and Corthral said that the Empire did not negotiate with primitives and did not accept defiance, and these were the principles that had built their civilization across 42 galaxies over 3,000 years. And Zethrak agreed that those principles had worked on 600 worlds, but then asked a question that had been forming in his mind, which was, what if the 600 worlds they conquered were not valuable because they were conquered, but because they were the kind of species that could be conquered? And what if by selecting only for species that would surrender, the Empire had been selecting for weakness without realizing it? There was silence, and then Corthral told him to continue, and Zethrak explained his thinking, which was that the Empire showed up with overwhelming force, and species either surrendered or died, and the ones that surrendered became subjects and workers, and soldiers that could not truly be trusted, while the ones that died were gone, so nothing could be learned from them. But these humans were showing something the Empire had never seen, which was true courage that was irrational and illogical and magnificent, and the Empire was about to exterminate it simply because it was inconvenient to the usual way of doing things. On Earth, General Linda Hayes received urgent intelligence saying that they were picking up encrypted communications from the Krell flagship to what appeared to be their command structure, and there was heavy traffic, which meant the aliens were discussing something, and the analyst said they did not know if this was good or bad. But the fact that the Krell were discussing anything was unusual, because based on historical patterns from their other conquests, they should have already attacked. And Hayes looked at the display showing Jake Morrison's Aurora and said that man had bought them time, and now the question was what to do with it. Her aide brought up a complex analysis and explained that the Krell Empire had conquered 600 worlds, but none of those worlds had ever rebelled after initial conquest, and once a species surrendered, they seemed to stay surrendered, but there was no record of the Krell ever facing prolonged resistance, because they were excellent at overwhelming force, but had no experience with guerrilla warfare or insurgency, or determined long-term resistance. And Hayes understood slowly that this was because every species they had met was reasonable enough to surrender when outmatched. The analyst continued saying that they had analyzed the Krell fleet composition, and it was designed for ship-to-ship combat and planetary bombardment, but was not optimized for occupation, and the Krell would need to commit massive resources to hold Earth if humanity was actively resisting, and those resources could not be deployed if they were managing a 42-galaxy empire. And Hayes felt a grim smile touch her lips as she realized that humanity could not beat the Krell in battle, but might be able to make conquering Earth more expensive than it was worth. In the Aurora, Jake Morrison received another communication from Zethrak, and the commander said that he had spoken with his superiors, who demanded he destroy the human fleet and subjugate Earth according to standard Imperial protocol, and Jake asked why Zethrak was telling him this, and the commander replied that he found himself in an unusual position, because for 300 years he had followed orders without question, and destroyed worlds and conquered species, but had never questioned whether the Empire's will was right until now. Jake asked what had changed, and Zethrak said simply that Jake and his species had changed things, because humans were not supposed to stand here and were supposed to surrender or die, and those were the only options the universe had given them. But humanity was refusing both options and creating a third option by simply standing, and Zethrak did not know what to do with that. And Jake offered to help by suggesting that Zethrak did not have to destroy humanity and could just leave and report to his empire that Earth was too costly to conquer and not worth the resources since they were small and far from major trade routes and not strategic. Zethrak said that the Empire did not retreat, and Jake countered that the Empire had never met humanity before, and maybe it was time for the Empire to learn something new, because they had conquered 600 worlds by being strong, but maybe they could become stronger by showing wisdom instead of just force. And Zethrak replied that if he returned without conquering Earth, he would be executed for cowardice or incompetence, and Jake said that if Zethrak destroyed humanity, he would prove that the Empire only knew how to solve problems by killing them, and asked if that was the legacy Zethrak wanted after 300 years of service. The channel fell silent but did not close, and in that silence Jake made a decision and told Zethrak that he was going to do something, and not to interpret it as an attack, because he was sending a data packet with information that Zethrak should see before deciding what happened next, and Zethrak asked what kind of information, and Jake said it was human history, and not the sanitized version, but all of it, including wars and atrocities and worst moments, but also recoveries and reconciliations, and growth, and how many times humanity almost destroyed itself, and how many times humans chose not to. Jake transmitted the file, which contained thousands of years of human civilization, compressed into data, showing world wars and peace treaties and genocides and truth commissions and slavery and civil rights movements and nuclear weapons and non-proliferation, agreements and the Holocaust and human rights declarations, and every beautiful triumph and every shameful failure. And Zethrak asked why Jake was showing him this, and Jake explained that Zethrak needed to understand what he was about to destroy, because humans were not innocent or perfect and had done terrible things to each other, but kept trying to be better and kept choosing to grow instead of staying in their worst instincts. Jake said that if Zethrak destroyed humanity, he was not just killing 8 billion people, but killing the idea that a species could learn from its mistakes and become something better. And on the Krell flagship, Zethrak watched the data stream, showing images of human warfare that was brutal and devastating, and then images of humans helping each other and healing each other and building together, and the same species that had developed weapons capable of planetary destruction had also reached the stars, driven by curiosity and hope. Zethrak's tactical officer said quietly that Supreme Admiral Corthral was demanding an immediate response and wanted confirmation that the hour that Jake Morrison had to save humanity felt both infinite and impossibly short, as he sat in the Aurora with his hands hovering over his keyboard, trying to find words adequate to the moment. And on Earth, 8 billion people waited while, around him, 200 ships held position, and ahead of him 1,000 Krell warships remained weapons hot and ready to end everything with a single command. And Jake found himself wondering how anyone could justify existence or prove that a species deserved to live when the question itself seemed wrong. General Hayes had assembled what she called a Civilization Council on Earth, and experts wanted to help craft humanity's defense, and philosophers prepared arguments about consciousness and rights, while scientists compiled lists of potential contributions humanity could make to galactic civilization, and artists wanted to send music and poetry and visual art. But Jake found himself ignoring all of it, because this was not about what humanity could offer the Krell, or about proving usefulness or value, but about something more fundamental than bargaining or negotiation. His console chimed with a private video message from his sister Kate Morrison, who was a high school teacher in Portland, and he played it and saw her face appear with tears on her cheeks but steady and strong, and she said that she knew he was busy trying to save the world, but she wanted to tell him something, which was that after his speech something had changed in her classroom, and these kids who could not agree on anything and argued about politics and religion and everything else had all come together, not because they suddenly agreed, but because they realized they were all human first, and that being human mattered more than anything else. Kate wiped her eyes and said that her son Charlie, who was 7 years old, had asked her why Jake went up there alone, and she told him because someone had to, and Jake chose to be that person. And Charlie said that when he grew up he wanted to be someone who stands up to, and Kate said that Jake had given her son a hero and given all of them permission to be brave. And the message ended, and Jake sat very still, feeling the weight of it, because that was the answer, which was not humanity's achievements or potential contributions, but simply what humans did for each other, and how they made each other better by choosing to stand together. Jake opened a channel to Zethrak and said that he had been thinking about what to say for the past 30 minutes, and had thousands of people sending him arguments and evidence and justifications for why humanity should survive. But he thought he had been approaching this wrong. And Zethrak appeared asking what Jake meant, and Jake said that he was not going to try to prove humanity deserved to live, because the question was wrong, and no species had to deserve existence, since existence was not a reward for being valuable but a fundamental right. Zethrak replied that rights were concepts invented by those with power to protect, and that the Krell Empire had the power here, and they defined what rights existed in this space, and Jake said flatly that made them tyrants, and asked Zethrak in all those 600 conquests and all that empire building across 42 galaxies, whether he had ever asked himself why, and not how or what, but why the Krell Empire existed at all. And what was the point of all this power, if all they did was use it to take more power? Zethrak was quiet for a moment, and then said that the Empire existed to bring order to chaos and to unite disparate species under one rule, and to prevent the wars and conflicts that tore civilizations apart. And Jake challenged him, asking whether imposing Krell wars instead was really better, and said that Zethrak had seen human history and knew humans fought each other constantly and had wars and conflicts and terrible violence, but also had peace and reconciliation and the choice to be better. And when the Krell conquered humanity, they did not eliminate violence, but just made sure all violence flowed from them, and that was not order, but oppression. Zethrak asked whether humans would rather tear themselves apart than accept protection, and Jake said he would rather have the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them than the safety of chains, and that humanity would never stop fighting for freedom. And if the Krell conquered Earth today, humans would resist tomorrow. And if they killed everyone on Earth, the story of human resistance would spread to other species, and Zethrak could not conquer an idea, and the idea of humanity, which was that freedom mattered more than safety, and dignity mattered more than survival, would haunt the Krell Empire forever. Zethrak leaned forward, asking whether Jake thought stories would destroy the Krell Empire, and Jake replied that the story of a species that chose extinction over surrender would make every other species in the Empire question why they knelt, and that the Krell had built their power on the acceptance that resistance was futile. But if humanity proved that some species would rather die than accept that, then the Krell did not just lose Earth but lost the foundation of their entire imperial system. On the Krell flagship bridge, the officers watched their commander process this, and the tactical officer spoke carefully, saying that Supreme Admiral Korthral had sent 3 more demands for status updates, and they could not delay much longer. But Zethrak held up a hand for silence, with his attention fully on Jake Morrison, and told him to continue. And Jake took a deep breath and said he was going to tell Zethrak a story about a time in human history called World War II, when one dictator decided his nation should rule over others and conquered much of Europe and killed millions and seemed unstoppable. Jake explained that there was a small island nation that should have surrendered, because the logical choice was to make peace and accept occupation and save what lives they could. But they did not surrender, and their leader said they would fight on the beaches and in the fields and in the streets, and they would never surrender. And that refusal inspired others, and nations that might have given up found courage, and people who might have collaborated chose resistance. And eventually the dictator fell, not because the small island had more ships or better weapons, but because they refused to accept that might makes right. Zethrak asked whether Jake thought Earth was that island, and Jake said he thought every species that refused to kneel was that island, and that empires which crushed that spirit were doomed to eventually fall, not today or tomorrow, but eventually, because power built on fear and force was inherently unstable and required constant violence to maintain, while power built on cooperation and mutual respect and recognition that all conscious beings have value was power that lasted and endured. Zethrak turned to his display and brought up the data Jake had sent earlier, and said that human history showed remarkable violence with wars of religion and resources and ideology, and that humans had nearly destroyed themselves with nuclear weapons, and enslaved each other based on skin color and committed genocides in the name of purity. And yet Jake wanted him to believe humanity was worth preserving, and Jake replied intensely that humans were worth preserving, because they learned. Jake explained that humanity learned slavery was wrong and ended it even though it meant civil war, and learned that genocide was inexcusable, and created international laws to prevent it, and learned that nuclear war would destroy everyone, and chose not to use those weapons again, and humans were not perfect and were deeply flawed but were trying to be better, and that capacity for growth and moral improvement and choosing to be something more than their worst instincts was what made humanity worth preserving. Zethrak said that could also make humans unstable and unpredictable, and Jake replied that it made them human, and that Zethrak was not just deciding Earth's fate right now, but deciding what kind of civilization the Krell Empire wanted to be, and asking whether they wanted to be remembered as the empire that destroyed a species for the crime of defiance, or as the empire that was strong enough to show mercy and wise enough to recognize value even when it came wrapped in resistance. Zethrak's image flickered, and he said that his orders were clear, and the Empire did not tolerate defiance, and if he allowed Earth to refuse subjugation, it set a precedent that could destabilize their entire structure. And Jake said boldly that maybe the Krell structure needed destabilization, and maybe an empire built on forced subjugation was not as stable as they thought. And maybe the only thing holding it together was that no one had dared to say no before, and maybe that was not strength but fragility disguised as might. The channel fell silent, and Jake could see Zethrak processing and the Krell commander's expression shifting through emotions that were hard to read on an alien face. And finally Zethrak spoke, saying that he had served the Krell Empire for 300 years and had never questioned orders or doubted their purpose. But Jake and his species had done something unprecedented, which was making him wonder if they had been mistaking obedience for loyalty and fear for respect. Jake asked what Zethrak was saying, and the commander replied that he would transmit Jake's words to Supreme Admiral Corthrell and provide his assessment that Earth represented a unique case requiring reconsideration of standard protocol, and he would recommend that the Empire choose a different path. But Jake needed to understand that his recommendation might be rejected, and the Admiral might order Earth's destruction regardless, and if that happened, Zethrak would have no choice but to comply because the Empire was absolute and his personal. The response from Supreme Admiral Corthrell came faster than Commander Zethrak expected, and the holographic projection materialized on the flagship's bridge with an intensity that made even veteran officers step back, because the Admiral's crimson scales seemed to glow with barely contained fury, and his voice could have cut through hull plating as he demanded to know how Zethrak dared question Imperial protocol and dared suggest the Empire show weakness before primitives. Zethrak stood firm, though he knew his career and possibly his life hung in the balance, and he said with respect that he questioned whether destroying a species that showed unique courage was strength or waste, because the humans had displayed qualities the Empire had not encountered in 600 conquests, and to eliminate them without consideration would be hasty. And Corthrell interrupted, saying that this was exactly what the Empire had done for 3,000 years, and they were not a democracy, and did not debate with lesser species, and did not hesitate when faced with defiance, and this was why they ruled 42 galaxies while others begged for scraps. Zethrak asked quietly how many of those galaxies truly served the Empire versus merely fearing it, and the silence that followed was deadly, and Corthrell said that Zethrak was overstepping, but the commander replied that perhaps he was, but he had served faithfully for 3 centuries and earned the right to speak truth. And these humans had done something no conquered species had ever managed, which was to make him question whether conquest was always the answer, and if he could doubt after 300 years of certainty, then perhaps the question itself had merit. Corthrell's image leaned forward and asked what question that was, and Zethrak said it was whether the Empire's strength lay in their ability to destroy, or in their wisdom to know when destruction served no purpose. And on Earth, Jake Morrison received an unexpected transmission, not from Zethrak, but from someone else in the Krell fleet, and a junior officer whose name translated roughly to Swift Scale said nervously that he was violating protocol by contacting Jake, but wanted him to know that Commander Zethrak's doubt was not isolated, and there were others in the fleet who had been listening to Jake's words and had begun to question. Jake felt his pulse quicken and asked how many others, and Swiftscale said enough, that if the order came to destroy Earth, there would be hesitation, and maybe even refusal, because Commander Zethrak had served longer and with more honor than any current fleet commander, and if he questioned the Empire's methods, many would follow his example, and Jake realized that he might have started something like a mutiny in the Krell fleet, and Swiftscale's expression might have been a smile as he said that ideas were dangerous, and humanity seemed to understand that instinctively and had just taught the Krell the same lesson. The transmission ended, and Jake immediately forwarded the recording to General Hayes, and within minutes she was on his channel saying that if what the officer said was true, then humanity was not just fighting for Earth's survival anymore, but potentially triggering an internal crisis in the Krell Empire, and that would either save them or doom them faster. And Jake said he knew, but they could not control that now, and all they could do was stand firm and hope that doubt spread faster than orders to fire. In the Krell flagship, Supreme Admiral Corthrell made his decision and said that Commander Zethrak was hereby relieved of command and would be placed under arrest pending trial for sedition and cowardice, and Vice Commander Thalrek would assume control of the fleet and execute the subjugation of Earth as protocol demanded. But before Zethrak could respond, something unprecedented happened when his communications officer stood from her station and said she refused that order. Korthral's image flickered with shock and demanded to know what she had said, and she repeated that she refused and would not facilitate the arrest of Commander Zethrak for questioning what should have been questioned long ago, and if recognizing courage in an enemy was sedition, then sedition was more honorable than obedience, and another officer stood, and then another, and within moments half the bridge crew of the flagship was standing in silent refusal. Vice Commander Thalrek looked around in disbelief and demanded to know what they were all doing, and ordered them to sit down because this was mutiny. But Zethrak said quietly that this was not mutiny but conscience, which was something the Empire had forgotten existed, and the standoff on the bridge was mirrored throughout the fleet as ships began reporting similar events, with crews questioning orders and officers supporting their commanders over imperial demands, and 3,000 years of absolute obedience were fracturing because one human in one small ship had asked a simple question, which was why. On Earth, sensor arrays detected something remarkable, which was that the Krell fleet's formation was breaking, and they were not attacking or retreating but fragmenting as internal conflicts spread, and some ships maintained their positions while others powered down weapons and a few began slowly backing away from Earth. And General Hayes stared at the display in disbelief, saying that the Krell were fighting among themselves over humanity, and over whether to destroy Earth or let it be. Her intelligence officer pulled up communication intercepts and reported that they were picking up massive chatter across the Krell network, and the word they kept using translated roughly to schism. And Morrison had not just bought humanity time, but might have broken the Krell Empire, and Jake Morrison, watching the same data from the Aurora, felt no triumph but only a deep responsibility, and told General Hayes that he needed to speak to Zethrak again immediately. When the channel opened, Zethrak looked older somehow and burdened, and he said that Jake had done something remarkable by breaking the absolute unity of the Krell Empire, and officers were refusing orders, and ships were declaring autonomy, and in 3,000 years this had never happened. And he asked whether Jake was proud, and Jake said no honestly, because he had not wanted to destroy the Krell civilization, but just wanted to save his own. And Zethrak replied that they might be the same thing, because if this schism spread, the Empire could collapse and 42 galaxies held together by absolute rule could suddenly fracture into chaos, and billions could die in the conflicts that followed. Jake said urgently that Zethrak should not let it collapse, and that the commander had questioned whether destroying humanity served any purpose. But here was another question, which was whether maintaining the Empire through fear and force served any purpose, and what if instead of collapse this was evolution? And what if the Krell Empire could transform into something better, like a confederation or a voluntary alliance of species that chose to work together instead of being forced to serve? And Jake said that humanity had experience with this because they had made every mistake the Krell were afraid of making, and had empires that collapsed into chaos, but also learned how to build cooperative systems that respected autonomy while maintaining order. Zethrak was silent for a long moment and then asked whether Jake would help the empire that came to conquer Earth. And Jake replied that he would help people trying to be better than they were, because that was what all of this had been about, which was the capacity for growth and the choice to evolve beyond worst instincts. And on the Krell flagship, the bridge crew watched their commander process this, and finally Zethrak turned to his communication officer and ordered her to open a fleet-wide channel to all ships and broadcast this to Earth as well, because everyone should hear what came next. When the channel opened, Zethrak addressed not just his fleet but both species, and said that he was Commander Zethrak of the Krell Imperial Fleet, and for 300 years he had served the Empire without question, and conquered worlds and destroyed those who resisted and believed this was strength and order and right. But today one human in one small ship had made him question everything, not through weapons or force, but through the simple act of standing firm and asking why conquest must be the only option, and why fear must be the foundation of order, and why difference must be met with destruction. He paused and said that he did not have answers to these questions, but knew that species that stopped asking questions stopped growing, and the Krell Empire had been the same for 3,000 years. And perhaps it was time they became something new, and therefore he was ordering all ships under his command to stand down and no weapons would be fired at Earth, and no invasion would proceed, because the humans had earned the right to their autonomy. Supreme Admiral Corthral's image burst onto every screen in the fleet and accused Zethrak of committing treason against the Eternal Emperor himself. But Zethrak interrupted calmly and said this was necessary because he would not destroy a species, for teaching the Krell to question, and if that was treason, then their definition of treason needed examination. And across the 1,000 ships of the fleet, commanders began making their choices, and some sided with Corthral maintaining imperial doctrine, but more sided with Zethrak choosing conscience over orders, and the fleet split not into enemies but into factions debating the future of their civilization. On Earth, the reaction was explosive as people poured into streets not in fear, but in celebration because they had been hours from extinction, and now watched an empire tear itself apart over whether to destroy them, and somehow that felt like victory. But Jake Morrison felt the weight of